There he is.
You know what?
I'm going to guess that you probably know that face. It's Ed Asner, of course, and I bet too that you've come to really be fond of him. Many, many people have. And I want to explore a little bit about why that even happened. And if you know the face too, I suspect that you can probably identify the voice either. I'm going to let you hear this real quick.
You got spunk.
I'm going to let him finish that thought in a little bit. I first met Ed in 2016, March of 2016, when I was working on Ensemble that Wendy had mentioned. We sat at this desk in his study. There's a lot there, as you can see, but he intrigued me, absolutely intrigued me from the very start. I find him to be an honest man, a self-effacing man to a fault, a man of many, many contradictions. Like, he's gregarious and he's irritable. He's erudite and he's bawdy. He's a journeyman actor and he's a major star. He's all those things. You sit with him amid his 7 Emmy Awards, his 5 Golden Globes, his multiple other honors and memorabilia. And you hear in that voice, that familiar voice, the resonant timbre of a formidable history that spans almost 70 years from his first performances at the University of Chicago to his work that continues to this day, like Dead to Me in 2018, and Blue Blood and Gracie and Frankie in 2019, and Blue Bloods as recently as 2020, and live performances and appearances and all of that. He continues all that to this day. You may be familiar with the Internet Movie Database, which lists film, screen, and television credits. This is one page from Ed's entry. This is one of 21 pages for Ed. IMDb lists something like 500 credits for him, and I'm sure they're missing a lot too. When you're with Ed, when you sit with him, and Jennifer will probably attest to this too, and Joyce, you sense the significance of longevity and perenniality. Longevity and perenniality. I spoke with the actor Paul Rudd, who was in a show on Broadway with Ed in 2012. And he said this: I feel like every generation has a relationship with Ed Asner. Think of that. I feel like every generation has a relationship with Ed Asner. That can't be said for too many people. So when Ensemble came out in August 2019, I turned to an idea that had been both pestering me and intriguing me since the first time I sat at Ed's desk. And that is a portrait of Ed Asner in his many facets and from multiple perspectives, from colleagues, friends, family, critics, fans, fellow activists, and adversaries. And that's what I'm working on right now. And I do want to stress that this is just a work in progress at this point. I'm still in the process of gathering and sorting through the material I've collected up to this point. Interviews with up to 30 people so far, and more waiting in the wings. Plus multiple conversations with Ed, mostly during the pandemic via Zoom. So if you'll bear with me this afternoon and forgive the gaps created by what I have yet to learn and what I have yet to sort out, I'm more than happy to share with you some of what I've learned up to this point. I think of this book as a print version of a hologram, those 3D images where you can walk all the way around them. It's an image, but you can walk all the way around and see a 3D image of a person. Those are shot with multiple camera angles. This is how they do it. Multiple cameras, and they're all filming at the same time. That's what I want to do, is multiple camera views of Ed to try to create a 3D profile of him. I did the same thing for Ensemble, and I just loved the form. So here's an example page. On the left, you see Julia Louis-Dreyfus says, she mentioned Sheldon Pentinkin and says Sheldon was a guru, hugely inspirational and instructive. And then if you drop to the bottom of the page, Rush Pearson, who was part of the same company Julia was, says, I remember Sheldon would come in and take a seat, roll a joint, so forth. And then on the right side, Paul Barras, who was also in the company, then shifts the narrative into another direction. He says, then a critical thing happened toward the end of 1981. So that's how it works. And that's what I'm doing with Ed too. As Wendy mentioned, we're going to be joined by Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, who wrote that book that, that Wendy loved and that I love too. So we'll hear more from her. And as she said, we're going to see Joyce Bulifant too, who played Marie Slaughter, Murray's wife in Mary Tyler Moore. And this is her book too, which I'll say something more about in a little bit. Not too long ago, I did a Zoom call with Lindsay Krause, who's a wonderful actor with a strong theatrical background. And she was in Slapshot with Paul Newman, just a number of things, a number of David Mamet films. And she was in Daniel in 1983 with Ed, Mandy Patinkin, and Timothy Hutton. And what she says here about Ed, I think is really, really interesting. She talks about, well, what she does is, let me put it this way. What she does is she gives me, without knowing it, she gives me 3 guiding questions that have been guiding this book. And I'm going to pull those out for you in a second. But she also introduces 2 of the main things that I want to focus on today, which are Ed as an actor and Ed as an activist. And she kind of neatly weaves them together. So although we were just having a conversation, she gives me a nice overture for this talk.
I was very fortunate to be able to play that part. Very fortunate. And I was very fortunate to be with all those actors and to play with someone like Ed, who not only had so much experience as an actor and as a New York actor, but also who had stood for the things he'd stood for in his life. There was tremendous amount of respect from me to him and love. And a kind of also that awe that you feel towards someone who really sticks their neck out.
Yeah, he sure did.
Yeah. So I felt that towards him also, this tremendous respect and kind of like, wow, who are you? And how do you become that? And how do you have that courage?
Isn't that beautiful? Who are you? And how do you become that? And where do you get that courage? And that's what I've been trying to explore with this. So like I said, those are guiding questions for me. Ed started out in Kansas City. He was born in 1929, and he was in Kansas City. And by the way he refers to himself is, I'm the son of a junk man. That's actually the cover of his memoir. His father's business, actually, which was founded in 1902, is still there in Kansas City. Ed played football in school and thought he wanted to be a journalist until a journalism teacher told him that he wouldn't make any money at it. He was eager to get out of Kansas, and with the help of his sister, applied to several schools and was accepted at the University of Chicago. He also served abroad during this time in the US Signal Corps, during which time he actually performed in plays that toured army camps in Europe. Then he returned to Chicago, where in the absence of a theater department, a young director named Paul Sills, along with a guy named David Shepard. And I should mention too that Paul is the son of Viola Spolin, the improv guru. But Paul had pulled together this little small company at the University of Chicago called the Playwrights Theater Club. They did something like 24 plays in less than 2 years. It was an ambitious schedule. but it only lasted 2 years. And yet it gave unknown mega talents to be their very earliest opportunity to test their abilities. So besides Ed, look at some of these people that came out of this. So there's Ed Asner, there's Joyce and Byrne Piven, Fritz, whoops, got a little ambitious there. Fritz Weaver, Barbara Harris, Mike Nichols and Elaine May and more. Susan Sontag every once in a while would appear in a play. So that's where he's coming. That's where Ed's coming from. This is a picture of him in Watsik in 1953. And Ed was starting to get really good reviews. And this one is quoted up there in the upper right-hand corner. After the second ellipse, it says, Edward Asner was playing of the, Edward Asner's playing of the exact title role was filled with understanding and genuine pathos. So armed with those reviews and the courage that it gave him, he moved to New York. And in New York, in 1956, he was in Three Penny Opera, and I think he was with that for about 1.5 years. But that too had a remarkable cast of people who would later become very well known. That's Jerry Orbach there, if you can see it. It's hard to read, I'm sorry. Jerry Orbach, John Aston, Jerry Stiller, B. Arthur, and Lottie Lenya were in that play. Ed was also in 1960. It must have been a small part because he's not really listed here, but he was in a play with Jack Lemmon too. But most of his bread and butter really came from television. And if you watched a fair amount of evening TV in the late 50s and throughout the 60s, like I did, you probably saw a lot of Ed Asner before you even knew who he was, certainly before he landed Lou Grant. So I'm going to take you through and just let you see the title slides of some of the shows that he was on, which I think is remarkable. And also for me, just looking these up was very nostalgic because I remember all of these shows. This was the first one. This was his first television appearance, Studio One in 1957. But look at some of these. Remember Naked City? If you look in the lower left-hand corner, it says 1960 to 1961. That doesn't mean he had a recurring role. What that means is he was so unknown that he would come back in different roles. Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Route 66, there he is. The Untouchables, Virginian, Dr. Kildare, I always watched that. He was in 2 Elvis Presley movies too, small roles. One in 1962, and you'll see another one in just a moment. He was in Ben Casey, which I always watched. Slattery's People with Gunsmoke, my grandma's favorite show. There he is. The Fugitive, my brother and my favorite show. He made this film El Dorado too, a Howard Hawks film with John Wayne. He played kind of John Wayne's adversary. Ed is down in the lower right-hand corner there. There he is with Elvis. This is Change of Habit. Interestingly, Mary Tyler Moore was also in this film, though they didn't really cross paths. And then this happened. In 1970, he was in a made-for-TV movie called The House on Green Apple Road. And it was in this performance that Grant Tinker, the producer, saw him. And he was creating a show for his wife, Mary Tyler Moore. And he was in the process of creating that. And he invited Ed to audition for the show. By Ed's own admission, his audition was absolutely god-awful. And in fact, he asked for a do-over, which he did. And then he left. And you'll see in Jennifer's book, I think it's in there. After Ed left, the producer said to Mary, that's your Lou Grant. And she said, really? It's also interesting to note that Gavin MacLeod, who would later play Murray, was actually the one who was slated to play Ed Asner, to play Lou Grant, which is really interesting because think how different that would have been. So that led to this. And I want to call something to your attention. Many of you may have noticed this before. But if you look at Ed's head, and then just above it, the picture on the wall is that's him playing football. So for the next 12 years, between 1970 and 1982, Ed would play the hard-edged, soft-centered Lou Grant, first in the half-hour sitcom, and then in a 1-hour drama series, which is pretty remarkable itself. During that 12 years, Ed Asner and Lou Grant became firmly planted in our collective memories, like a beloved relative. He accumulated, this is the Lou Grant show that followed it. He accumulated 17 Emmy nominations with 7 wins. That's still the most for a male actor. Second to him is Art Carney. 11 nominations for Golden Globe Awards and 5 wins. He didn't just earn his Emmys though for Lou Grant, the Lou Grant role. He was Captain Davies, the conflicted slave ship captain in the miniseries Roots, for which he received an Emmy Award. And then he played Axel Jordache. I recently watched this again with my wife, Rich Man, Poor Man, and his performance in this is just extraordinary and extremely moving, especially if you're only have him pegged as this Lou Grant character. I talked to his son, Matt Asner, and Matt is in his own right. He co-founded with his wife Nava Paskowitz Asner something called the Asner Center for Individual, the Asner Family Center for individuals with special needs in their families. But I asked Matt what it was like to watch his dad on TV, because we all know what it was like for us to watch Ed on TV and to get that kind of, have him get himself planted in the culture and in our brains. This is how it was. This is what it was like for his son, Matt. And interestingly, the conversation turns to Rich Man, Poor Man.
What did you think of the fact that he was an actor when you were a kid?
Older child. I didn't really understand what the hell he did. I'll tell you actually where I did understand it. What made me understand it was seeing him in Rich Man, Poor Man.
Huh.
So when I would see him on television, it was just like, oh yeah, it's my dad. But when I saw Rich Man, Poor Man, I saw that and I just thought, oh my God. Now wow, that's crazy.
What do you mean?
What you're, it was so foreign to me that he became this character that I didn't recognize. I guess that's what it was. I didn't recognize him. I didn't recognize who he was. I could not see him in that role. I could not see my dad in that role. He became that character. And I could not see any Ed Asner in that role. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, I understand what he's doing, and I could get it.
As many of you know, we just recently lost this wonderful man, Gavin MacLeod, who played Murray Slaughter. It was less than 3 weeks ago on May 29th. He was a dear friend of Ed's. And I think I'll always remember, I was in LA last month with Ed, and I'll always remember walking into his home on the second day of my visit. And his first words to me were, Gavin is in hospice. And I said something silly like, how does that make you feel? And he said, that leaves me, Betty, and John Amos. I was fortunate though to be able to speak with Gavin a couple times, actually. He's a dear man. And he made an interesting observation about the significance of the fact that most of the core cast of the Mary Tyler Moore Show came from theatrical backgrounds, as Ed did. Let's listen to what he had to say here.
Most of of the cast were all from the theater. All of us are from the theater. We've all done. That's where we came from before we got into films and things and that.
That seems significant to me that you all came from theater. Do you see it that way as a
Well, I think it's wonderful. I think it shows you how what great taste the producers had. I think you hire theater people, and they're used to discipline. They're used to to work on early. You know, you get to work. If the call is at 9 o'clock, you're there at least by 8:45. You know, it's just your theater training is completely different, and you're very responsible. You come in, you have to know your lines, and you're I don't know. A theater background is completely different than the film background.
It sounds like the theater training really creates its own unique kind of discipline.
There's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it.
And then I wanted to, in that same vein, I wanted to return to Lindsay Krause and her talking about Daniel. She's so thoughtful. I love using clips from her. She talks about what he was like as a scene partner, and I wanted to share that with you too.
What was he like as a scene partner?
Well, what I loved about Ed, as a really fine actor, was that we could be talking about something before shooting, and Sidney would say action, and I'd look up, and there was Ed, but it wasn't Ed. He was absolutely relaxed. I think it was a quality of attention that he paid, because Ed didn't do overboard character work, anything like that. You know, he wasn't. It wasn't some outfit he had on. He completely himself. But there was a quality of concentration and listening. And I was thinking last night before this, I was thinking about the scene in which, you know, he really delivers really bad news to me in that film. And I think I faint at the end of it. And yeah. And what I felt from Ed was that he was trying to stay even in telling me, but I felt a kind of deep sadness that went way back to his shtetl, you know? I felt a deep sadness in him. And those things were delivered so subtly, and they were a kind of quality of attention. So I admired Ed for his character work, and also for his generosity. He was real New York actor that way, not fussy, not calling attention to himself.
I heard that kind of sentiment over and over and over again, that he wasn't about, you know, star turns. He didn't want to draw the attention just to himself. He was very much focused on the work itself, very much focused on the work itself, and actors appreciated that a great deal. I wanted to share another thing from Paul Rudd. I quoted him earlier, but Paul Rudd is of a very different generation from Ed. But if you think of what I'm about to play for you as just one example of many similar examples, I think you'll get a sense of what's happening here with Ed as he crosses generations. They were in a play in 2012 called Grace on Broadway. It was with Paul and Michael Shannon and Kate Arrington. And this was 2012. And what Paul said, listen, I'm trying to figure out how to listen for the appreciation across generations here. That's how I'd like to say it. The appreciation across generations for the art, not just because he's a nice guy and everybody loves him, but for his work ethic and his art.
I think that also speaks to the type of actor he is. That he cares. He puts in the work and he cares. In a way, that's the most impressive thing to me of all. So here he is in his 80s, and a play is hard. It is a difficult thing to do. 8 shows a week on Broadway. My God. And I think this is a guy who has worked for decades, been successful for a long time, lives in California, is now going to come out to New York, away from his house, for months to do a play. And he's not phoning it in, and he's not doing it for just to work. I mean, he cares about the play. And I think that was the thing that was the most amazing thing to me, and it's since been the case. I mean, when he's emailing me about autism and the causes he's involved with it, but I would just think, my God, I hope when I am his age, I can care that much about anything, because that seems to me to be the secret to any kind of longevity, is to care, to just be interested enough. His interests are apparent, and he had such a drive, and it just kind of knocked me out. It still does.
Yeah.
Before we go to Up, I was just having a memory, and this is a side note just about the process of putting this work in progress into play. When I went to LA, I played a lot of these clips for Ed. And one of the things that came out of the pandemic, if there's a silver lining for me anyway, is I captured so much on Zoom, and I have video recordings now of many of these interviews. And when I played that, when I sat with Ed in his kitchen and played those for him, I wish I had been able to capture the look on his face, his response to those, to hearing those people talk about him. And, I had so wanted to be back in person with him, but I do wish I'd had video recording of that. And then on a downside, sometimes technology doesn't work. And I had a great interview with Paul. It was about an hour or so. And he was really comfortable. He was sitting on the floor in front of his couch, and I just loved it. And it was a great shot. And when it was all over, I realized all I had was the audio for it. So that's why there were stills there. But again, going back to the idea I was trying to communicate here, he has touched generation after generation after generation of audiences, but artists too, and it makes an impression. In 2009, he did the voice of Carl Fredricksen in this gorgeous Pixar movie called Up. It was directed, oh, there he is, I love that. It was directed by Pete Docter, who, this picture is from the most recent Oscar Awards, where he received an Oscar for direction of his more recent film, Soul. But I talked to Pete, and I talked to Jonas Rivera. Pete's down in the bottom frame. And I talked to Jonas Rivera, who's the producer of the film. And they talked just a little bit about Ed's technique too, which is another angle on this. I'd like you to hear that.
I also think he has this great sense of timing that's not something you can really articulate, but it's like a musical ability that you start to pick up on. And I was kind of hinting at that in reference to the writing, the crafting of words, listening to the way he'll put in those pauses and then attack, and so those kind of things. I think also understatement and the ability, because a lot of times in our films we have characters yelling all the time and very emphatic, because energy is kind of what drives the entertainment. But Ed has this ability of holding back and waiting and using these sort of pregnant pauses and then finally saying something, and that there's a real charge to that. It's like a containing an explosion and then letting it go.
So here's a prime example of that. You'll recognize it.
You know what? You got spunk.
Well,
I hate spunk.
I asked Ed about that moment. What was that moment like for him? And he told me the story that Jennifer captured this too, where the run through in the afternoon for the pilot did not go well. Mary was in tears. The audience barely responded. Spunk got very little reaction. And then that evening they had to shoot the real thing in front of an audience. And Ed describes this for me here, what it was like for him.
So we went out there on Friday night. Alan Burns said, just play the hell out of it. So we said, okay. So I got out there on the Friday night and got to that point of, you got spunk. I hate spunk. And that audience of 300, I felt so powerful with them. But the response was so enormous. I felt I could do no wrong. And the show just kept getting hipper and hipper and higher and higher from that moment on.
So after 7 extraordinary years, we're going back to Mary Tyler Moore here. Mary and the producers decided to quit while they were still ahead, while they were still on top. And interestingly, the premise of the final episode of GMTV's new station manager I'm sorry, I messed that up. The premise of the final episode was that the new station manager came in and fired the news team. And this is them saying goodbye to each other. And perhaps with a dig at television news, or actually even prescient, this is the only person that they kept, Ted Baxter. So Ed went from that to Lou Grant, a 1-hour drama series with the exact same character, but played in a different way. Lou Grant went on the air exactly 4 months and 1 day after Mary Tyler Moore went off the air. During this time too, during part of this time, he served as the president of the Screen Actors Guild. And he was a controversial figure, there's no doubt, in part because of his outspoken nature and his deep-seated impulse to champion the underdog and the outsider. Here's an example. When President Reagan fired 11,345 striking air traffic controllers in 1981, Ed was out there picketing. So what I'm getting at is his liberal politics was never a secret. Then on February 15th, 1982, all hell broke loose. The CBS Evening News, Dan Rather reported, television's Lou Grant, Ed Asner, was in Washington today. He led a group of show business personalities opposed to President Reagan's policies in El Salvador. Lee Grant was part of that little contingent, and Ralph Waite, who played the father in The Waltons, was part of that too. Rather goes on. And they announced a campaign to raise $1 million as a donation, and this is how they said it, to Salvadoran rebels. Asner handed over a check for $25,000 to a Mexican doctor who was supposed to use it for the healthcare system of rebel forces. Ed became involved in that because what his concern was the effect of the rebellions and the war on people, especially in rural areas, who were not getting health care, were not being taken care of. And so that's why the money went directly to a Mexican doctor. But you can see how it was being treated in the news. Gene Reynolds, who's a producer, one of the producers of the show, said this, and he said this to Doug Daniel, who wrote a wonderful book on the show, Lou Grant. The American public this was his concern. The American public was so aware of Ed Asner's position politically, and that's something you shouldn't have. People were looking at Lou Grant, the character, and seeing Ed Asner. In other words, he was playing a journalist, and especially at that time, you were supposed to be impartial. You're supposed to tell the story from various angles. And here, people were looking at Lou Grant and seeing Ed Asner, which he saw as a significant problem. This is Robert Walden, who played Rossi, if you watched the show. And he put this different spin on it. He said, it was set up as him, meaning Ed, being pro-communist. That was what was in all the papers about it. What was basically initiated as an act of humanity became a political situation. So what ended up happening was sponsors dropped the show. There were bomb scares, literally bomb scares during this time. His co-star, Daryl Anderson, who played a character they nicknamed Animal, he was the photographer, only half jokingly bought him a Kevlar vest at one point. The show was abruptly canceled before its sixth season, the planning for which had been underway. There's disagreement that I'm still sorting out about whether there was a distinctly traceable cause and effect here. But what I do know is the show was canceled and it was abrupt and the ratings were still good. In a New York Times article, Ed said, this is 1982, May of 1982. On the left, there's a pullout there. Edward Asner, who is president of the Screen Actors Guild, accused CBS TV yesterday of bowing to political pressure in dropping his Lou Grant series for next fall's season. He told me that during the next several years, he thought of it as being gray listed. He wouldn't go as far as to say he was blacklisted, but it was very hard for him to find work during this time. But here's the key. He did not back down. Ed continued to be outspoken during this time. And like I showed you, some of the effect of his acting and his dedication to his craft on younger generation, I'd like to share his activism too, the impact of his activism. This is Jason Alexander in the center there. He was in a film. My phone was ringing. He was in a film with Ed, and they did several other projects together too. You might remember him as George Costanza on Seinfeld. I know Jennifer does. But Jason drew an interesting distinction for me. He was talking about how people like him who do have a or to speak out about a cause. And he said Ed did that. But he said, Ed took it to another step.
Ed trumped us. Ed did the work. Ed said, it's not enough to be the mouthpiece. I have to be the motor. I have to be the engine. I have to be the hands. And when you commit that far and that hard, you're the hero of some and the enemy of the others. And for a performer to take half his audience and chuck it takes enormous character and courage.
Yeah.
And you have to, and what Ed was saying was, I have two jobs in my life, but my activism outweighs my actor. And most actors don't make their living as an activist. And so they're very afraid to make that choice. Even if they were motivated to make that choice, it would leave them empty-handed. Ed was willing to take that risk.
Still does.
Absolutely still does.
Mike Farrell, who you may remember from MASH, that's him in the back row with the mustache and the big smile. Also is very much an activist. One of his big causes is the death penalty. But he and Ed are kind of bonded around that and are very close friends to this day. And I talked to Mike about this. There he is, with his activist hat. But what I did was I played Jason's clip for Mike to get his reaction. And what this will give you a sense of too is how the book is stitched together. So I'll play the clip from Jason Alexander, and then Mike will respond to it, and then somebody will respond to Mike. But this is what Mike had to say about this. I thought it was very touching.
That's interesting that he said he had to be the motor as well as the.
Yes.
That's very interesting. I mean, that's a big goddamn burden to have to carry. That sense that you're not only the spark plug, you're the engine itself. I suspect that's a heavy weight that he's carrying for being a Jew, being an actor when other people have work for a living. And then being a star and becoming a star probably surprised him.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he embraced it beautifully, and used it. That's a big load to carry. I think he gets. Personally, I think we owe him a big debt. Being an activist can do great harm to your living, and it did to his. But I think he's one who doesn't back down, and he's one who understands, for whatever reason, he understands being somebody who came from hard times and had to struggle, had to fight, had to grind his way to. But he got to a place where he was a good, solid working actor, and then he got the chance to be Lou, and ran with it. And Jesus.
Ed got involved with something called the Global Health Partners, which was founded by Bob Schwartz, who's in the lower right-hand corner of the frame there. And they were bringing medical money for medical help to the people of Cuba in 1998. He took Ed and he took Muhammad Ali at the same time. But this is what Bob wanted to say about Ed and working with him.
He's been very bold and very courageous. He stood up for unpopular and controversial issues that have cost him. Ed. Ed is not like many of his Hollywood peers. He's not a wealthy man. He's a working actor. Yeah. And when he lost a top 10 TV program, Actors Guild, those were big things. But he felt he could not do what he was doing. He felt that strongly about it. So he's a very complicated person, but in his heart of hearts, in my mind, he represents the best of America. Really does. He was a military veteran. He was a union worker before he was an actor. So he brings a lot of experience to the plate. And when he stands up, it'd be easy. A lot of Hollywood actors and actresses, not to knock groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but those are low common denominator issues. Mm-hmm. And Ed doesn't touch those as often as a lot of Hollywood celebs do. He doesn't shy away from a lot of the tough issues, and it's cost him. So,
how does it affect you to see it cost him like that?
It hurts. It hurts me, and I think it's a tremendous disservice to a very, very important person, not just in my life, but in so many people's lives.
there's a knowledge, there's that thing that happens with people who have been through the mill and back, that they learn something along the way. And there's a sense of wisdom. You can sense his wisdom, and you know he didn't come by it easily. It's just.
Right. There's a thing about actors of Ed's generation in particular. It continues, but there are people like Brad Pitt who's done extraordinary things in New Orleans, and Sean Penn. But in Ed's generation, it seems like it was everybody who attained a certain level. The first thing that hit them was, how do I give back? And it's why you see such a high level of involvement from people like Ed or Mike Farrell or Martin Sheen. It's a very powerful thread in Ed's persona.
I remember Sydney saying to me, even when they put the hood on you, until the hood goes over your eyes, you just let them have it. You just let them have it. And I think people like Ed, who from a young age really were determined to stand for change, to stand for, constantly, don't let them put the hood over your eyes. You just keep defying what everybody else just gets crushed under. You just keep lifting the roof, That's an extraordinary person.
Yeah, he is.
And I really admired that in him.
I have talked a number of times to Ed about his activism, and he usually says something along this line. This is a direct quote, but there's always a different version of it. But he said, am I really deserving of the designation activist? They offer it and I go with it, but I don't know anymore. I don't know anymore. I feel like I could do much more. During the very first conversation I had with him about this book, I was trying to see if I could find some idea of what might be the theme, what he might even see as a theme that ran through his entire career. And the way I tried to get at it with him is I asked him what he thought was his greatest asset that has gotten him to this point in his life. And after he said, of course, my drop-dead good looks, I told him what I perceived as a prominent theme weaving through his career. And here's that brief exchange, which has given the thrust to this book.
What I'm so interested in is you've got this incredible persistence, to this day. And it seems like what I'm hearing there in these various stories is this phenomenal persistence of yours in determination to do this.
Yeah. You stumbled on the right word.
It's like Ed too. I like that he didn't say, hey, you nailed it. He said, you've stumbled on it. But persistence is the thing. And I hope that that's come through in what I've shared with you. This last very brief clip, and then we'll turn to our guests. I wanted to end with this because it really will give you a sense of just Ed as a person, his warmth and his kindness, and also his irresistible desire to give you a little jab too along the way. The context was in November of this past year, a film festival was doing a screening of a documentary called Ed Asner On Stage and Off. And they asked me to interview him as part of a pre-show that would lead into the screening of the documentary. And I'd like to share with you how he signs off, because this is Ed too.
And Ed, my God, it's always a fascinating to talk to you. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, I feel
like a baby who's just been coddled by you. And I thank you for your kind treatment. I thank you for your praise. I thank you for your falseness.
It comes naturally.
They'll find out. They'll find out. Just wait, Buster. Just wait.
That's right. Thank you, Ed. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Great to see you.
The best to you.
You too, and your family.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Me too. Perhaps you could tell I've grown quite fond of this man. I just think he's remarkable. And so now I'd like that's my formal part, and I'd like to turn to our guests now. So I'm gonna get rid of the screen, and Wendy, here you are. Joyce, are you here too? Is Joyce checked in?
I am checking right now.
And then we'll open up Jennifer. Jennifer, you can see how much I've drawn on your book.
Yes, that you can't say favorites about books, but I have a really soft spot for this one for me among my books. And so it's always nice to see it out there in the world.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book. I just love it.
Thank you so much. I'm wearing my Rhoda shirt for you.
Oh, that's perfect. That's cool.
One of the writers actually gave this to me. This really was like they had these on the set and she gave me hers from.
Oh, that's cool.
Which I really treasure, and I like whenever I can bring it out to an audience who will appreciate it. You know, like some of the kids, maybe you don't get it, but it's very exciting for me. So
I've got this.
Nice. That's so cool. I need that.
I hate spunk.
Look who just joined us.
Joyce, you are here. We need to unmute you though.
Unmute her though. She looks fabulous.
She does.
She always does. Can we unmute her?
She is now.
Thank you for being here, Joyce. It's wonderful to see you.
Good to see you.
Oh, now we can hear you.
In person.
In person, sort of.
No mask today. Here.
No masks.
I went into a coffee shop and it was the weirdest feeling. I could see people's faces.
Is it wonderful?
It's great. And I get to hug people. I love that the best.
Oh,
and I just realized there are lots of stories about Ed. As I was driving here today, I'm at John's house in his kitchen. Stories I didn't tell you about Ed and that I was thinking about. So there you go. I'll surprise you.
Well, I could always call you again, and I hope we can do that.
Right.
Before we turn to Ed, could I, Joyce, I'm going to ask both of you, but I'll start with Joyce. Do you want to say something about Gavin? I know that you...
Absolutely, yes. I'm going to speak at his memorial.
Oh, are you? Mm.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
Do you have a sense of what you want to say?
Mm-hmm.
You can't share it with us? Not yet?
Well, I'll share it with you when I talk about Gavin, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to make it short.
Okay.
Because the other people will be speaking and I don't want to, it's awful when people go on and on. So I'll just tell you quick little.
Yeah. You want to do it now?
I think he's talking about right now.
Oh, right now? Oh, shit.
That was one of the greatest comedic moments I've ever seen.
Timing was incredible.
That's my son, John.
Hi, John.
Hey guys, how are you?
Good.
Are we on now? Is this a live?
Yeah, we're on. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought we were just using the breeze. I'm blonde, remember? Yes, I do want to say about my lovely Gavin.
Yeah.
The most wonderful thing is that I flew in from Colorado because I knew he was going into hospice and I didn't want any time to go by. And I was there the first day and I leaned over his hospital bed, and I gave him a kiss on the forehead, and he took both my hands and he held them to his chest, and he started singing a duet that we sang together in a show that Roger and I wrote. And I ended up singing with him, if only for a moment I could see you again. If only for a moment I could hold you again. If only for a moment I could tell you that I love you, love you. Tears coming down her face. But somebody asked me for a quote, and I said, if the world were peopled with Gavins, it'd be a much more wonderful place. He was just a great guy.
Yeah. And you two stayed very much in touch, didn't you?
Oh, yes. And we did a lot of benefits in the desert for different theaters and different children's programs. And great.
Earlier in the presentation, in the formal part, I was showed a picture of you with as Marie.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Yeah.
And your adoptive son.
Oh, yes, yes.
It's a great
I got all confused being me between Mountain Time, Pacific Time. I did, so I missed the whole beginning.
I'll send it to you.
Oh,
That's a beautiful moment you just shared with us. Thank you for being willing to share it.
Absolutely.
Jennifer, what about you? Did you want to say something about Gavin? I know that you had a nice time with him too.
Really did. I mean, I'm still a little choked up by that story of singing with him, that I can totally see that too. I was really lucky. I did get to interview him for my book about the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And I was also, when I was growing up, I was completely obsessed with the Love Boat, like to an extreme degree. Like I have this memory of how I got to watch the Love Boat in Fantasy Island if I spent the night at my grandparents'. And so I was always trying to angle to spend the night at my grandparents' on the right night so that I could do that. And just, I mean, my gosh. And so to be at lunch with the captain of the Love Boat was a really incredible experience for me. And he said the nicest thing, which I really feel like is just because he had that sense of knowing what would make people really happy. And he said, "Oh, you remind me so much of Mary." And I had patterned my whole life after that character. I became a journalist. I wrote a book about the show, everything. I did feel in a very cosmetic, vague sense, I resembled her. And I saw that when I was a little girl. I think I saw myself in her. And so all of those things, and I was also a little bit of a people pleaser like her. So I was always having the same struggles as her. And for him to say that was just really, really sweet. And I mean, he was so generous with his time. I remember sitting there with him for a while in the desert with his I want to say palm tree kind of shirt, print shirt on. And it was such a special experience. And I think he understood the effect that he had on people when it came to these iconic characters. I think he understood that I grew up watching him and that this was so special to me.
You know how people say about other people, I never heard him say an unkind word about anyone. He didn't. I mean, he really didn't.
Yeah.
And he loved everything. Even when it was terrible, he loved it.
My very, very sadly limited time with him, it was 2 conversations. You picked that up immediately, though. He's such a generous soul. And he led me to you, Joyce. He said, "Have you talked to Joyce yet?" I said, "No, I haven't." She said, "You must talk to her. I'll call her. I'll get you in touch."
Oh, that's sweet.
I have him to thank for that. Let's turn to Ed. And then I have this question for you each. And then I'm very interested in what the audience, what their questions are too, Wendy, if you want to start feeding them to us. But Joyce, do you have a very early memory of being in Ed's presence and professionally? Do you happen to remember?
Oh yeah, I do. Oh, Gruff Ed. Oh, funny Gruff Ed. I was at my first reading at the table reading of Mary Tyler Moore, and I am very dyslexic, and I had taken my script and slipped it under the table and looked ahead to see what my lines were so that I wouldn't be embarrassed. I could sort of figure it out when it was my turn. And Ed said, "Hey, little girl, you looking to see how many lines you have?" I'm embarrassed.
Were you embarrassed?
I was mortally embarrassed. And he loved, to this day, he loves embarrassing me. I can't even tell you some of the things he's done to embarrass me. He's getting naughtier and naughtier with each year of his life. But when I was doing the show, he would do any fundraiser that I asked him to do. I did a great big thing about dyslexia, and I had celebrities playing different famous people who are dyslexic, and he played Thomas Edison. And nobody got paid. Julie Harris did it, Stephen Cannell did it, Patty Duke did it, the Lennon sisters did it. And I mean, if you want to believe in God and the Holy Spirit and all of that, the universe coming together for me to do this show where nobody got paid. And we filmed it, and 80 dyslexic children were in it besides.
That's wonderful.
It was great.
Ed, if there's a cause that he believed in and that it touched his heart, he was there.
Absolutely.
He is there. I should say he is there.
I did have a scary time sitting with him at a Screen Actors Guild meeting, the union meeting. Oh my gosh. We were arguing back and forth in this big auditorium, and he was really gung-ho and everything. And I had to leave in tears. I couldn't stand the thing.
It was too emotional. Huh?
Yeah, it was.
He fights for his causes. That's one of the points I was trying to make.
Oh yeah, he does.
Jennifer, you got to interview him too, didn't you? Where did you meet with him?
At his house.
Okay, good.
Really special. You did that once, right? You got to do it
a couple times, yeah.
So yeah, I was at his desk with him. And at least at the time, I don't remember if you and I talked about if he still has this, but at the time I was there, this for some reason really struck me. He had on his desk in his home a nameplate on the desk that said Edward Asner, as if like someone might not know in his own there, which I thought was just so funny.
Yeah.
And he was wearing, strangely, a lot of these interviews took place with these men wearing these like Hawaiian print shirts, but he too was wearing like a Hawaiian print shirt, but instead it had his character from Up all over it.
Oh, that's great.
I also thought was really cute. It was like, you're not going to get confused about who you are interviewing here. There's a nameplate and he's wearing a shirt. And yeah, that was another really special experience. I mean, you played the clip of him talking about the "You've Got Spunk" moment in the run through and then the final taping. And he told that story to me. He was like, that's a story that I really blew up in the book, was that disastrous first run through and the changes they made to kind of make it the final taping much better. And one of the big things he talked about was how he figured out he had to maybe modulate just a tiny bit, like from that first disastrous experience. He was like, oh, I'm still scaring them, essentially. Like, I'm like a little too much, right? He was used to playing kind of dark characters. And here he was going into comedy, which was pretty new, and they were taking a chance on him. And a lot of the network's executives said, we don't want to do this. So he realized like, oh, I'm still coming on a little too strong. You know, people were very protective of Mary, like the audience was very protective of Mary Tyler Moore. And so they were worried about both Rhoda kind of trying to take the apartment away from Mary in the pilot. That was something that a lot of the notes said, like, we don't like this lady who comes in and is yelling at Mary. And also Ed's character coming on a little strong when we didn't know him that well yet. And so, and to get the effect of "You've Got Spunk," right? The whole joke there is that it's about kind of like, usually he's going to say like, isn't Spunk great? And instead he says, I hate Spunk. That's why it's funny. But he had to make sure it was actually funny and not threatening. So he kind of demonstrated for me how he took that down. And so he did it twice, the way he did it when you just played that recording. And I just remember also, I mean, I feel like all my stories are like this, but like, it was such a thrill to me that there's this iconic man doing this iconic, you know, line reading in front of me. And what really struck me listening to your recording too is how he loves to tell that story. He tells it, he loves to, can you imagine how many times he's told that story?
Yeah, exactly.
And he tells it every time as if he just thought of it and he is running, right?
Nobody's ever asked me this.
He is doing that line reading. He's doing that performance. He loves any chance to perform, including when he gets to tell this story, which, I mean, you know, if you've been interviewed about anything, you know, that keeps coming up, it's like a lot of people get annoyed after a while. We've both interviewed people where you can tell they're like, oh God, why are you asking me about this again? He is happy to tell you. Like, that to me was so striking.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right. He goes into it as if it's totally fresh. Joyce, do you have any observations you could share with us about what he was like on set as an actor and what it was like to work with him there?
He was just always delightful. I never saw a mean bone in him except,
except once.
I used to be a Republican. I'm not anymore. But I was doing something for Nancy Reagan, and I asked if I could leave an hour early because I wasn't involved in the last scene. He was very upset. Not because I wanted to leave, but why?
Oh, for the reason.
Yeah, that's right. He's a very liberal fella.
Right.
And as you said, he will go and show up for any cause he believes in. My son John did a film called A Boy Named Poe about an autistic young boy, and he was there. You know, he's wonderful.
Yeah, he's there. That's right. When do we have questions from the audience?
We don't, surprisingly, we don't have a lot. We have a lot of really nice comments. And Jennifer, thank you for answering the questions about your book. Let me.
I have a question then.
Well, wait.
I thought you didn't have it.
One question is Mark referred to Ed being Jewish, and the guy from MASH. Yeah, Mike referenced that. So Michelle would like to know, was he active in the Jewish community at all? I know from Jennifer's book, I think it was Jennifer's book, that he was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish family. He spoke Yiddish fluently, but I don't think he was very observant, and I don't think he is observant now religiously, although culturally he's Jewish. But did that come up, Mark, in any of your discussions?
Yes, it does come up. He often, you two could even probably attest to this as well. He throws in Yiddish words a lot, and then verbally parenthesizes them, the translation for me. A number of people have talked about that. It's very much in his bones, even if he isn't fully observant. It's just a part of him. And Paul Rudd made the really interesting comment that he felt he shared something with Ed because they both came out of Kansas. They both were actors. They both were Jews. And he said to Ed once, there's just not a lot like us in Kansas, right? And there's this outsider status. And Ed talks a lot about the outsider status. And I alluded to the fact that he's very much drawn to causes for the outsider, or the
for the underdog.
The underdog, yeah. Jennifer, you were nodding. Did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, that all checks out with what I knew as well. And I even would pontificate a little here and say that probably, I think a lot of his activism stems from that background. Not uncommon to see Jewish people taking up these liberal causes, being accused of being communists. That's very common. It's a common way of saying something else, is to accuse a Jewish person of being a communist, particularly back several decades. So it's very much in keeping, I think, with that cultural Judaism of believing in lifting up everyone and, you know, helping these causes. So involved with.
And there's also a philosophy of tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. And
That's Ed too.
yeah, very much so. So we do have some other questions.
Can I just see if Joyce?
Sure,
say anything
absolutely.
about this?
Yes.
You don't have to, but did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I just wanted to say that I'm a Jew in my heart.
Yeah, thank you.
I am. I really am. I mean, I think Jewish husbands are the best. I'm only married to one Jewish husband. But one.
He was a good sample.
Was that Roger?
No, that was William Asher.
Okay.
But Roger was a very good soul. He was. We went to a center called the Center for Spiritual Living, which envelops all religions.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so let's see. Lots of people were very happy that you focused on his activism and how brave he is. Okay, open questions. Davida says this is not a question, but that listening to the description of Ed, he's a mensch. I think we would all agree with that.
I'd like to say something about that too. And Jennifer and Joyce, you may agree. He loves to play that grouchy character. You know, it manifests, you know, I've talked to him so much, and a conversation will frequently begin, and pardon my language, but he'll come on the screen or I'll walk in the room and he'll go, "Oh, fuck, it's you again." You know, and that's very much how he likes to play it. And that kind of runs through the whole thing. Why are you asking me that? You know, that kind of thing. But the reason I played that clip at the end is he's so warm. He's so kind too, almost in spite of himself. I think he's got this tremendous empathy. Sometimes that is almost more than he knows what to do with.
I've not met him, but he gives the impression of being the grumpy old man, but a complete marshmallow and teddy bear inside. You just want to hug him.
He's very kind. Joyce, what were you going to say?
Well, I just remember that very much better. The Disney fan club invited Gavin and me and Ed to a luncheon and then a sort of question and answer with the Disney fan people at Disney Ranch in the desert. And Ed was really naughty with the F-bomb. And I thought, oh,
at
Lord,
Disney.
Walt Disney could hear him now. I mean, he was, but it always makes me laugh. And I wonder if because of his tender heart, if he doesn't do the grumpy F-word things just to not seem sappy. Because I tell naughty stories not to seem sappy. But Betty White said I can get away with it because when I tell a naughty joke, it sounds like a nursery rhyme.
What a great line. That's a fabulous line.
But Betty White tells dirty jokes all the time. I mean, watch that classic clip from her on Saturday Night Live with the muffins. I mean,
Well, it takes one to know one.
Yeah, right. Jennifer, I wanted to ask you one. Wendy, did you want to say something else?
One of the questions was Ed blacklisted? He was gray listed.
Yeah.
And you have not found any proof, any paper trail of him being canceled because of his work, his support of the rebels. But
it's difficult to tease that out, and there are different versions of it. And CBS has never said that was the reason. Ed feels strongly that it was. A lot of people do. He and Mike Farrell, I think, used the term gray listed because he didn't want to go so far as to say I was blacklisted. And part of that this is part of that modesty too. He said those were people who did amazing things. That's not what I did. You know how he plays it down? So I was grade listed, you know, but it was tough for him to find work. He admits that.
Just an idea that, I mean, Dan Rather is very active on social media. And when you played that clip, it was surprising to me that an objective journalist would be reporting something with, you know, a story that sound biased. I mean, it definitely,
didn't it?
It had a flavor. And, you know, because it was a CBS program, there might have been corporate pressure, but I would reach out to Dan Rather and talk to him to see if he recalls.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you.
But anyway, lots of comments from people who met him in person, that he was just so warm, affectionate. He's a hugger, he's a kisser. So one question that has come up that I think really talks, you know, addresses his talent, that the differences between playing the same character in a comedy and in a drama. And he is one of only 2 people who received an Emmy Award for the same character in 2 different types of shows. The only other person is the woman from Orange is the New Black, and the therapist character in, I can't pronounce her name, Azuba.
Jennifer, do you know?
I do know who you're talking about.
She has a difficult to, pardon me?
Noah Duba.
Yes, thank you. I didn't want to take a guess and be wrong. So she also has gotten awards for drama and comedy, but, you know, Ed played the same character. So how did he talk to you about how he adapted the character for the different, the venues? I mean, one was a half hour with a lot of well-known people where he wasn't carrying the show. And then with the drama, it was an hour long. He was carrying it, which was, you know, an extra burden. So it's kind of fascinating. It speaks to his wide range of talent.
Right. It was, Joyce, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have to voice myself as an actress right now. Actor, you'd say now. The famous line is, drama is easy, comedy is hard.
Yeah.
And most people who can do comedy can do drama, and not the other way around, I find. And he was good and adapted both.
He was awfully good. Well, you know, when you look at Roots and you look at Rich Man, Poor Man and the stuff he's done on stage, there's so much more than the Lou Grant. It was and there's a section in my book about that. The transition was difficult for him, partly because 7 years in playing this in a comedic way. I think it's Alan Burns who made an interesting distinction. He said, if Lou Grant in the Mary Tyler Moore Show, if it's a comedy and he takes a drink out of his drawer, you know, it's just a joke, right? If it's drama, he could get fired for that, right? I'm completely making a mess of it, but that's the distinction. If he takes a bottle out of this drawer in a drama series, he's an alcoholic, and that's what it's about. And that, I think, that distinction helped him, but he struggled with it. And he was really kind of depressed about it too, because he was so fixed in that other rhythm. He was so used to all the other people around. There was an audience. Suddenly there's no audience, right? It's, you know, you're just playing a scene with one person, the others aren't nearby. It was so different for him. And he even went to a party once, and I think it was Alan Burns again, said, well, you look so depressed. He said, I just don't think this is going to make it, because he couldn't find it. He couldn't find it. So, but he did, obviously. He obviously did.
And there was, you're talking about Mary Tyler Moore, the Mary
Going
Tyler
from Mary Tyler Moore to Lou Grant.
Okay. Because Jennifer describes in her book
Mary and Lou and Rhoda and Ted. That was what everyone kept asking. We keep holding the book out.
And then Joyce's book.
Thank you.
Both delicious reads, completely different stories, but equally fascinating. The pressure with the Mary Tyler Moore Show was Mary was coming from the Dick Van Dyke Show, and everybody thought of her as Laura Petrie, and people were so afraid, the idea that Mary Tyler Moore could not be a virgin. I mean, her character.
Until years into the show, whether she finally stayed out all night and was on the pill in season 4 or 5.
I mean, it was just so interesting that there was so much. They wanted to make the writers wanted to make her divorced, and there was so much corporate pushback about that. So completely different starting points, and how much the country changed over those 7 years.
I mean, that's the thing. And I mean, I think also, this is just kind of me on a little bit of a tangent, but it's making me think of how different things were then versus now, and how doing that, going from a so-called comedy to a so-called drama wouldn't be as big a deal because you can barely see the difference anymore. Our comedies are very dramatic at times now. And sometimes Orange is the New Black was hilarious at least half the time. So we don't make those distinctions as much, but back then it was like you were really one or the other. And I make the point that the Mary Tyler Moore Show actually pushed the ball forward on this in terms of, I think they were one of the first to do more drama in your comedy. And we saw Ed do an incredible job at times. I just gave a talk recently where I played the clip when Edie leaves him, when his wife leaves
Just talking about that. Yeah.
And I was giving this talk on Zoom and I showed the clip, and then I came back and I was crying because I still, no matter how many times I see that, it's devastating. So he was doing a little bit of that on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but the sort of corporate distinctions and maybe to some extent the audience's distinctions were so much clearer that I think that was a harder transition. I would also say though that the corporate forces were not giving the audience enough credit, because one of their things was Mary can't be divorced. They're afraid that they're afraid the audience will think she divorced Dick Van Dyke. Come on. The show is pretend, and if they don't, I don't know what to tell them. They shouldn't be watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show. But I do think that it was so much harder just because there were these ideas in TV that were so set that it made it even harder, that you must be serious almost all of the time on Luke Grant because we've decided it's an hour long and it's a drama, so they made that job even harder than it needed to be or than it would be now.
Go ahead.
Do you think that Maude and All in the Family and the fact that those shows were kind of leading the way and breaking new ground, that anything Mary Tyler Moore's team came up with just didn't seem quite as shocking because Norman Lear was going first.
For sure. I mean, I personally, I don't ever want to take sides in this one exactly, because I think All in the Family is brilliant. But for my taste personally, and I think for something to have longevity in terms of you can turn it on now and it still feels fresh and new and of the time. I actually think the Mary Tyler Moore Show wins out, at least for me. I like that they did the more emotional stuff. I like that they were a little toned down and wouldn't just throw in the headline of the week and let it explode like All in the Family did, which was great. But I think you can turn on the Mary Tyler Moore Show now and it feels timeless. And I think part of that is that it didn't have that explosive rip from the headlines quality that made everyone talk about it at the time. I'm constantly begging young people to watch the Mary Tyler Moore Show on Hulu because I think they would love it. And it's non-problematic in all the right ways. it feels like just a timeless period piece about the 1970s.
And it's not just, it's way far from just fluff though too, because it was very much of its time. And we're looking at male-female relationships, but also working relationships in the workplace were really changing. And that was playing out in that show too. Joyce, did you feel that at the time? Did it feel like you were making that kind of societal comment, or were you just having a good time?
I was not always in the show because I was doing 2 other shows.
Yeah.
I was making very big comments. And one was the very first Bill Cosby show, where he played a basketball coach and I played the school guidance person in school, and we were great friends. And that was a Black person and a white person together in scenes as friends. And then the other show I was doing, when I was going back and forth, I couldn't be there all the time for the Mary Tyler Moore show, so that's why they got Georgette in there. But I was doing a show called Love Thy Neighbor, and I was playing Ron Masak's wife, and he was working for a Black man, and they were our couple next door. And there were all kinds of jokes about Black and white, and it was really interesting. I mean, one of my favorite lines though is when my friend, who was a Black friend, and I decide we're going to share a cleaning lady, and we're sitting there with a newspaper saying, well, do we get a Black housekeeper or a white housekeeper? And I say, why don't we share a Puerto Rican? I mean, it was really, he would say at dinner, please pass the brownies. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be offensive. They were, all the jokes were out there that were just, it was like All in the Family, but with a Black couple and a white couple. So it was really interesting because Mary Tyler Moore seemed kind of tame to what I was going through on those other 2 shows. And it was kind of refreshing to go to Mary's show.
Neat. To have them both.
Yeah.
That's it's just such a testament. It's such a time capsule, what you're both talking about here. It gives us such a time capsule into the times that I just find fascinating.
Yeah.
Did it come up in any of the discussions that Mary is the only character who never calls Ed Asner Lou? It was always Mr. Grant.
Well, that's funny.
She tried calling him Lou. Do you remember that episode?
I do, but even the other women on the show called him by his first name, and it just, yes, they were, she was an independent woman. She was living alone. She had a career, but there was still that, like nice girls or ladylike girls. I don't know. Did it come up in any of the discussions?
Yes, this is a huge deal. This is like, and you mentioned the other women. If the other women had called him Mr. Grant, we would have a huge feminist problem on our hands, right? If it was the women calling him Mr. Grant and the men calling him Lou, then yes, this is not okay. But this was like a flashpoint at the time. I mean, people wrote what we would now call think pieces in Ms. Magazine about this. It came up in a panel discussion where Jim Brooks was on a panel with Gloria Steinem, and she like called him on it at a forum about women. Yeah, I mean, I had to go get the notes from this forum to find out, I found them in Gloria's archive, and I was so happy because he told me the story, and I was like, well, I really need to know for sure if this is true. So this was a huge deal at the time. They would always cite the I hate to do this, but the feminists, there were some people talking about it out there, and the sort of feminist line on this show was actually that it wasn't feminist enough for the time. Even though we look back on it as this big iconic feminist show, one of the big things they cited was that she calls him Mr. Grant. And I think, and I am a huge feminist, but I think that Jim and Ellen's answer to this was great, which was they were like, no, this is we do character, and this is her character. This is a girl I shouldn't say girl, woman who would, I think she's kind of a girl-like character at the beginning, but this is a woman who would call her boss Mr. Grant. And maybe I am biased on this because I'm from the suburbs of Chicago, so I've always related really strongly to Mary's character in so many ways. And I was raised really similarly. I was raised that you call everyone Mr. and Mrs. to the point where me and my friends from way back when still call each other's moms and dads to this day, even though we're in our 40s, we call them Mr. and Mrs. It's just the way I was raised, so I totally get it. And that is one of the funniest moments in the entire show, in my opinion, because they've built it up so much that it's right toward the end that she tries calling him Lou, and it is one of the funniest line readings in history, as far as like that whole episode, her and Lou together trying to go on a date is
it's
the funniest thing, because they are both firing on all cylinders. They know those characters so well, and they understand that they absolutely should not be on a date, and everything about it is hilarious.
Yeah, and the kiss.
And oh my God. Everything that, just as a side note, just because it's so funny, I also want to add that one of my favorite things about that episode is that everybody involved told me, like, all of the men involved were all saying like, no, Lou and Mary should get together, and Mary and the women were like, no. I don't think, like, it was just it's such a clear picture of like, the men think that this man should be with this woman who's what, I don't know, 15 years younger than him or something. And, you know, they all think clearly these two belong together. And the women were like, no, I don't. It's not quite like the other men that she's dated so far. I don't know if you've noticed. It just, and then they go with this great idea, which is like, it is the most awkward date in history. And I think it's so much funnier and better than anything that they could have done with them actually getting together.
I know we're over time, but let me just get in this recommendation to people too. Watch the very first episode. I mean, there's so many things. The first episode is almost perfect in a lot of ways. And the brilliant Treva Silverman, who wrote a number of episodes, including the one with the Eva giving, or the divorce one, talked me through the very first scene. I did a first interview, and then she said, can you send me the first episode? Can you find a way to do that? I sent it to her. She did a complete deconstruction of the opening scene in where she's applying for the job. And she said, it's all there, because what ends up happening is he'll say, are you married? You know, and she's like, you could tell her mind's going, I don't think you can ask me that, but then what if I don't get the job? And it's right there. So I would suggest, and then maybe I could find a way to share the tape of Treva deconstructing that for me, because I thought it was brilliant, just brilliant. Joyce, do you have any final comments to?
No, it just was an honor and a privilege to be on the show, and I loved every minute of it. It was great, and thank you. And on this show too.
Joyce, I read your book. First, I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, so we have. I did Southampton.
Oh, I love Bucks County.
Yeah, near New Hope, and so I the book started off on a great note for me, just personally, but you have been everywhere. You have met everyone. And you weren't even name dropping, but just, you know, Walt Disney walked me over here, and
Fred Astaire.
I mean, it was really just amazing, and such a rich life, and you have this wonderful brood of children that, you know, a great family, and a very interesting romantic history, but, you know, but based on love, and, you know, that tingly feeling that you describe so well, the butterflies, you know, it was just really, really wonderful. But
Well, that's so nice of you. Thank you.
It's
I like that it seems to be helping a lot of people, and that was really the object, you know. And I get some wonderful letters from people saying how it's helped them out of a relationship that was not healthy for them.
Yeah. It's such a highly engaging read. When I finished it, that's when I contacted you and wanted to do a Zoom call because I just wanted to talk about it.
That's
You
so
know,
nice. Yeah.
it
That's
was
very nice.
that kind of book. And Jennifer, we just love your book too. It is such a good look into what was going on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, how it came together. That's what's so cool, how it came together. And that too is a highly engaging read. I just loved them. I just loved it. Both those
I
books.
agree. So I have one final question, although I will check in to see if there are any. Has Ed kept himself active during the pandemic?
Yes. He's done Zoom performances. It was a few months ago now, but I tried to schedule a Zoom call with him, and his daughter told me he was in New York doing a live show.
You mentioned IMDb. He has 5 or 6 things, like he's booked years into the future.
Yeah.
In addition to all the, half a dozen things that are in pre-production or post-production. An incredible work.
Constantly, yeah.
So one thing I am so curious about, who came up with this font and the very distinctive logo?
That's a good question. I actually don't know who came up with the original title sequence. I know about the theme song and I know about the actual sequence, the theme sequence, which are both brilliant and iconic. But that's such a good question. I don't know. And it's so good. Like, obviously it's so good that we just ripped it off for my book cover and it looks great. And I love it.
And so distinctive. And I love how, if you look at it like from far away, it seems like the outlines of a city, that urban flair. And, so, yeah.
I'm gonna see if I can find out. I don't know if it's possible to find out who
Wouldn't that be interesting?
The credits, but the logo, but I would love to know.
And it looks like it's a unique typeface created just for this. So
we all associate with it.
Yeah, like that feels like no one else can use it except if you want to smoke that, because
exactly
that thing.
Let's also, this is Jennifer's new book, brand new. Just, during the pandemic, this came out.
Right.
When Women Invented Television, the untold story of the female powerhouses who pioneered the way we watch television.
And Betty's one of them. Betty White is one of them for me.
Yeah, she's in the book, yeah.
It's about her early career, which I had not known a ton about when I had originally kind of met her as a viewer through the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And it was actually during the research for my Mary Tyler Moore Show book that they had mentioned a couple things that kind of inspired them. One was they mentioned a woman named Gertrude Berg, who was a huge star in the late 40s and early 50s on television, and actually wrote, created, starred in, and produced her own show called The Goldbergs about a Jewish family in the Bronx. And she was this incredible powerhouse that I couldn't believe I hadn't heard of before. And I felt like other people might feel the same. And the other thing was that they mentioned that Betty's character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show was inspired by, the way they first described her in the script before they cast her was a Betty White type. Sue Ann Nivens was supposed to be like a Betty White type, sickly sweet on camera, but then the minute the camera goes off, as Betty herself said to me in a quote, she's a stone cold bitch. Betty loved playing with the dichotomy of that, because Betty, as far as I know, is not that. She's just sweet. And when they mentioned this to me, though, that this character was inspired by a Betty White type, I was like, I don't know what that means before 1970, because I only knew her from the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And when I looked into it, of course, she had this entire lifetime of a career in the 40s and 50s as one of the first people on television as a talk show host in Los Angeles, who indeed was known for being incredibly sweet. And that's why people love to invite her into their homes, and to this day continue to love it. So,
but wasn't her, I think a distinctive part of the character she played on Mary Tyler Moore was kind of promiscuous, a little slutty.
Yeah, that's not based on, that's what I'm saying. Like, the idea is like, wouldn't it be funny if the Betty White from 1950s, who had like the high, she was known for her high necklines, which is one of my favorite details about her earlier career. Like, this was a thing that they were all saying like, everybody's gonna be wearing high necklines because Betty White is the hot new thing. So she'd wear these flouncy little dresses, just like she did as Sue Ann Nivens, and was very sweet. So the joke of the character on the Mary Tyler Moore Show was supposed to be kind of like, what if that person who is so sweet on camera, the minute the camera turns off, is just awful? That's what she got to play, which I think, I love everything Betty does, but I truly believe that her Sue Ann Nivens performance is like peak Betty White. When she gets to do that, when she gets to be awful, we still understand that deep down Betty's so sweet that it works for us. But that first episode that she's on, when she has the confrontation with Cloris and she kicks the oven door closed on her souffle. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go look it up, go watch it. That for the first episode that Betty is in, she is incendiary. Like, she is on fire. Highly recommend.
And so when you spoke to her, did it come up that the character she plays on Golden Girls is kind of the opposite?
That's so true. And I think actually what this even like relates back to what we've been saying about Ed from the very beginning, which is these people are playing with personas that they're always playing with it, right? So they sort of have a core to them, and then they're sort of always playing off it, whether it's like, wouldn't it be funny if I was secretly terrible but also sweet in front of the camera, or then, leaning, I feel like, I don't know this for sure because I don't know Betty personally well, but it feels almost like her character on Golden Girls is like leaning the other way. It's like, what if she was this sweet, but also maybe a little bit dimmer than Betty, obviously. But that, I feel like they're always, and that's what Ed's doing with kind of that like gruff persona, but soft center.
I love the contradictions. It just is interesting.
Yeah, it totally works. And I have this theory overall that like the worst, these terrible characters that we love, like I think of the characters on Seinfeld too, they're often played by people who are just tremendous human beings, like Jason Alexander or Julia Louis-Dreyfus. And I think the reason we can love these characters who are so awful is because we can kind of sense behind them that these people who are playing them are actual mensches, and it makes us sort of love them and hate them at the same time.
Joyce, do you want to have the final?
I'm so sorry. No, I have to go. I
was so conscious of the time. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's just that I don't want to keep someone waiting, but I enjoyed every minute and meeting both of you ladies, girls, friends, comrades.
Thank you so much.
Joyce,
thank you so much. It was so wonderful to meet you and to see you, and what an inspiration.
Well, thank you very much. And you too.
Thank you.
And Mark, I'm going to try to get to Chicago to see Evan. So I'll give you a call.
Please do. Please do. I'd love to see you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. And Jennifer, I'll find you in New York next time I'm in New York. Bye-bye. Thank you, John. Thank you.
That's one of the many children.
See you guys.
So, Mark, I have one final question. I know I've said that before, but so we're talking about all the sexuality that the women played. And did any of Ed's characters put their toe into that area?
You mean outside of Lou Grant?
Yes. I mean, I don't even recall something on Lou.
Oh, I thought you were, yeah. When you say other characters.
No. I mean, did any of his comedic or drama work, tie into all the sexual innuendo that the ladies, that the women characters kind of nailed?
That, I think, first off, that's a brilliant question. And it's,
Oh, thank God.
it's something I really want to look into, because nothing's popping into my mind when I think of the body of, the 500 roles that I talked about earlier in the talk. Nothing comes to mind, but I don't want that to be the answer. So I am going to look at that. I think it's a really interesting question, especially because his career does span this incredible time in American life. So thank you for the question.
And he was so great in Dead to Me.
Yeah, right.
So
Things lately.
Pardon me?
He's had some wonderful things lately. He was even in Cobra Kai. Like,
yeah.
I mean, and Dead to Me is one of the greatest.
I mean, he played such a good character. He was heroic in that. But yeah, what a funny show that is. Okay, we could keep talking forever, but
I so appreciate this.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really enjoyed your book. Thank you so much. Mark, what a delight for setting all this up. We are so grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I don't know what to say. Levy lecture people, there are 90 plus of you still hanging on. Next week, we're going to do a show about Motown. It should be lots of fun. Get on your dancing shoes and turn the volume up.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Linda. You do a good job.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Take care. Jennifer, it was so wonderful to meet you.
You too.
Good to see you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Mark. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks a lot.